Good afternoon and welcome back to Sport Management 340, Sport and Film. Today we are going to go over the Crossan textbook. Again, we're still working in our first week and our first module. Today we're going to be covering chapters 2 and 3. So we're looking at the history and genre of sport films. So our goals for today are to try to just go over sort of the basic idea and understanding of the history of the sport film, sort of how it emerged and its time frame, and then do want to make sure that you are able to describe the genre of a sport film itself. So the first thing I want us to try to do is to make a timeline. So this is a combination of information that you'll find in both chapters 2 and 3 of our Crossan text. But I want to just get sort of a basic idea of the time frame we're looking at when we're talking about sport films. So when does that start? When did we first start seeing the use of photographic moving pictures? That would be in the 1870s. So sport was involved from the very beginning with our earliest experiments in trying to have moving pictures. Gymnasts were a part of early scientific experiments in trying to put motion in pictures. The Olympic Athletic Club in San Francisco was also used in that. Athletic movement, if not competitive sport, was really sort of the first prime material that scientists at the time used to try to see if they could capture movement on film. So that's where we see sort of the beginning in the 1870s. We see moving pictures. Then as we move towards the 1890s, here's where we start seeing the first filming of pro boxers. So that actually happened in Edison's production studio. So it was a recreated boxing. They weren't real matches, but we, in the 1890s, start seeing the filming of sport. And in 1896, so mid-1890s, is the first public screening of a film, which was actually in France. But so 1870s, we're seeing moving pictures, essentially. 1890s, we start seeing actual films, public screening of films, and they're already starting to use boxing, right? So through the early 1900s, we see a significant amount of a relationship between boxing and prize fight films and film itself. Right? So we're going to come back to explore that a little bit more in detail, the relationship between boxing and film. But just know that the time frame that is happening, right, is 1890s here through sort of the 1910s. But what's interesting to note is that boxing films hit a real shift in 1915. So what happened in 1915? Try to find that for me, because it relates to our more broad social issues. It relates to race. So what happened in 1915 is that there had been significant racist reactions to Jack Johnson, who was a black boxer, right? And so those films, his fight films, were banned because of race, right? This was a racist reaction to him. And fight films from this time frame, which had been really important, essentially died out in the 1915. So interesting shift here. But as we go on through the timeline, right, so sport film over time, by the 1920s, sport films are sort of a well-established part of American cinema. The golden age of American sport is said to be the 1920s to the 1930s. Sport are growing in importance, growing in popularity, and there are a lot of sport films during this time period, right? So 1920s, once we get to 1930s, we start seeing the addition of sound, right? Up until then, they had been silent movies, silent films. So now we are seeing sound added, and we see our first sport film musicals, right? Sport-themed musicals, which sounds a little funny. So we see that sort of the golden age through these 20s and 30s. By the time we hit 1950, the 1950s, sport films are already considered cliche, right? They're seen as predictable and inferior to the other sort of more sophisticated versions of films that were coming out at the time, right? So by the 50s, it's not the big golden age of the subject matter of films at the time, right? What's interesting is that even though sport films had been being made and continued to be made, they weren't really recognized through this time period, sort of past the 50s. That it wasn't recognized as a genre until sort of all the way up to the 1980s and 90s. So we get to the 1980s and 90s and we see our first sort of critics addressing sport films, but they're generally categorized in terms of other genres or by the specific sport that is featured, right? So if it was a dramatic movie, right, that involved sport, instead of being called a sport film, it would have been a drama, right? So it's a drama that has sport in it. Or they were considered like football films or horse racing films. They were determined by the nature of the actual sport that it was, rather than being seen as this cohesive genre in and of itself of a sport film, right? So we start seeing examples of this through the 80s and 90s, but critics, right, really didn't identify sport film as its own standalone genre until 2008, right? So relatively recently, when the American Film Institute finally recognized that genre. Okay? So this is our sort of basic timeline. We're going to go back and explore sort of the early emergence and the relationship between boxing and film, and then we'll lead up to talking about that genre and what makes up that genre. So back to the beginnings, right? So in this sort of 1890s to 1915 time frame, we see a huge influence of boxing on film and film on boxing. So there was a reciprocal relationship between boxing and film. So if you had to, describe that to me. What impacts did boxing have on film, and did film have on boxing? Right? Boxing was the first example of a feature-length film, of having it that it is really long instead of up till then it had been short sort of movie clips. So the first feature-length film. It's also considered the first use of actors because most of the boxing matches that were filmed at the time were not actual matches, they were recreations. So they would use the boxers, but they would stage the fight after the fight actually happened for it to be filmed. So it's seen as sort of the first use of actors in films. And the first commercial cinema exhibition, so where they actually like played a film at a theater for money, that was a boxing film, right? So it's seen, boxing and prize fight films are seen as sort of the birth of American realism cinema, so trying to show what the real world was about, right? So boxing also impacted film by encouraging technological developments. So people who were filming the prize fights wanted longer capacity to film the whole fight. So it increased and encouraged technological developments within the industry. So cameras and projectors could handle longer films, and the length of the films meant there had to be less editing. So boxing itself had all of these impacts on film. But the relationship didn't just work one way. It also worked in the other direction. So we see how film had significant impacts on boxing, right? So at the time, boxing in the early sort of late 1890s, right, in that time period, boxing was seen as pretty shady. Boxing was corrupt, right? It was illegal in many places. It was known for violence and for betting. So it was seen as sort of a shady operation. Once people started seeing it on film, it started to become much more popular. So having prize fight films modernized and really legitimized boxing, right? It also mediated the way that we see boxing. So think about that. We covered that in sociology also. The idea that when you're not seeing something in person, when you're seeing it through a film or through television, right, that subject is represented, right? And the filmmaker or the TV producer decides what you see, and they can make decisions about that. So filming boxing mediated that experience. And for many people, that made it more pleasant, right? Now you're not at the shady theater with all these like sweaty people around you who are all betting and it's dangerous and dirty, right? If you can watch it on a film, it started to increase the audience. So now they enjoyed the fact that it wasn't the spectator experience of really being there. So it increased audiences for boxing and expanded that audience to women. So media and cinema in particular was part of the legitimization of boxing. Prize fight films also changed the business of boxing, because up until there were prize fight films, right, most of the money made for boxing matches were just ticket sales, and that really wasn't very much money, right? It wasn't enough to cover the payment to the boxer, and there really just weren't a lot of profits. So how boxing promoters made money was betting, right, and putting on sort of theatrical tours of the match. But now, if there were film rights, this was a whole new revenue stream for boxing as a business, right? So we also see that filming impacted the way boxing was put on. So now promoters of boxing matches are picking venues and they're staging the fight in ways that were best for filming. So we see lots of examples of how the film industry, the filming of the prize fight, really changed the sport. You might be able to identify ways that we see that even now. Can you give me some examples of where a sport has changed because of the media, right? That somehow they changed something about the sport or the way that they produce the sport in order for it to be represented in the media. There will be current examples of that. So boxing, prize fight films, really important in the early stages of sport films. There was this reciprocal relationship between boxing and film where they both had really huge impacts on each other. Boxing wasn't the only sport that was used in these early film days. There were football films and baseball films, but boxing was the most significant sport film in the early years. Okay? So let's follow ourselves up the timeline here and get towards where the film industry and film critics start to be thinking about sport films actually as a genre itself. So like always, whenever we're doing key terms, we have to figure out what these words mean so we're all on the same page. And as I referred to in Chapter 1 in our last video, that we would explore genre a little more closely, we're going to do that now. So what does the word genre actually mean, right? Genre is a specific grammar or set of rules of expression and construction. So it's a particular pattern or set of rules that apply to a type of film, okay? So that is our genre. Sport films have not been considered their own genre until very recently. As I said, they have often been referred to as subgenres of other already characterized genres like drama or tragedy or things like that, or they were part of the sport that they were about. So, why do we care? Why does it make any difference if sport film is considered a genre? What do people use genres for anyway? So, think about that. What do we use genres for anyway? It's both good for the audience and especially it is good for the filmmaker. It's good for the audience because if you know the genre of a film, right, it's easier for you as a consumer to identify what you like, right? It's easier to identify consumer preference if it's divided up into these nice organized categories of genres, right? But it's more important for the filmmaker. Filmmakers use genre to take less risk, right? They want to know that their movies are going to be successful, and so if you just keep making the same movies in the same genre, it gives you a pattern that you can just modify that doesn't pose a lot of financial risk, right? So being part of a genre can be really important, and it helps movies get made, right? Because filmmakers and production studios are more willing to take the risk when the risk is lower, right? So let's talk about what are some of those archetypal patterns that we might find within a sport film. So this again is in chapter 3, So what are some of those archetypal patterns? Those patterns can include comedy, tragedy, romance, and satire. So those might be archetypes that we'd find within the sport film. But other film critics have talked about subgenres of the sport film. So not just patterns that we see, but actually subgenres. What are those subgenres? The first is dramatic / biographical. Second is comedy / fantasy. And then documentary. We have an entire module on documentary, so I'm going to leave most of that until we get into the documentary section, but we'll talk about the others. So I want you to think about examples, and you will do this on your quiz. Think about examples of sport films that you have found, that you have seen and enjoyed, hopefully, that fit these patterns. So something that is a comedy sport film, a tragedy sport film, a romance sport film, a satire sport film. Then subgenres. What might be a dramatic or biographical sport film, a comedy or fantasy sport film, and a documentary sport film. When you start trying to identify movies that you've seen that might fit into these categories, you might run into the question, well, how do I figure out if it falls into this category of sport film at all? What really is a sport film? How much sport needs to be in the movie before it's considered a sport film? And that is a really good question, right? So let's talk about that a little bit, right? What criteria do you think we should use to say, yes, that film has enough sport in it to be a, quote, sport film? What do you think? Take a few minutes. Make a few notes. See what they might be. What our text says, right, is that generally it does involve competitive sport. And sport as we traditionally understand it as a competitive physical exercise. So you're not required to think that these are the correct criteria. I am interested for you to think through which of these criteria you think are best, which one you think we should use. But generally, critics have said, in order for it to be a sport film, it can't be about chess, right? Whether or not you think chess or poker are sports, right? Generally, those would not be considered sport films because they are just about our traditional competitive physical exercise type sports, right? Other criteria that critics have used is that the sporting element is significant to the progress of the storyline. So the sporting element, maybe that's a sport team, maybe it's an athlete, maybe it's a league, but whatever the sporting element is a significant part and it's necessary for the progression of the storyline, right? It also, a criteria that people have used, critics have used, is that the participant who is engaging in athletics, right? Athletics are the primary activity of the film. Other criteria include that films that are sport films actually need to address the question of duality, of recognizing that there is a sporting world and a social world, and that those are two separate things, right? And that the sport films address that question, right? That they look at the differences and the separation between the social and sporting world. Other criteria critics have used are that the film to be a sport film, right? That the sport, again, activity, it can be event, it can be an athlete, it could be a spectator even, that the film requires or relies on that sporting element for the plot, motivation, or resolution. So the cause, the motivation, why we have the story, that has to do with the sporting element, or the resolution of the principal conflict in the film is due to the sporting element. Okay? Other criteria that critics have used have been that sport in a sport film performs an allegorical role. It's an allegory. It's telling us something more important and more broad. It's not just about the referential meaning, what we obviously see on screen, right? But it's about the more implicit meanings, the story, the allegory of what sport can be, right? Or the criteria can just be that the primary protagonist, right, the main character, is involved in athletics. Okay, so these are potential criteria. Again, you don't have to agree with those. The film doesn't have to meet all of those. I want you to think through, what do you think makes a sport film? Which of those criteria would you use? How do we decide what goes into a film in order for it to be a sport film? Okay? So, once we figured out what the criteria are that we're going to use to figure out if something is a sport film, then we have to figure out, well, what are the characteristics of a sport film? What happens in a sport film to make it a genre, right? Because we talked about genres are classification mechanisms, they are patterns, there's this set of rules. Well, what are the set of rules for a sport film genre? Okay? So, first, think through that yourself. What do you think? If you had to pick out what you think is common in a lot of the sport films you've seen, what do you think they would be? What our text tells us is that the sport film genre often includes duality, which we talked about up here when we were talking about whether it is a criteria for it to be a sport film. But the idea is just that a fundamental characteristic of a sport film is that it often has dual protagonists, so two main characters, or dualistic structures, right? This is obvious in a lot of sport because there's an opponent. There's a protagonist, a main character, a good guy, and then they have an opponent. So that's a common characteristic of the sport film genre, right? Another characteristic, and this is true across genres, not just sport, but that they use the same material over and over, right? That there are cliches. This is a criticism that's been made of sport films since its very beginning, right? We talked about by the 50s, everybody already thought sport films were a big cliche. Turns out that that is still part of the genre, right? It tends to use the same material over and over. What are some of the cliches that you can identify? Think through the movies you've already seen. What are the cliches of a sport film? Then, another characteristic, of a sport film, the genre of a sport film, is depending on repeated situations and themes, right? So the cumulative effect of a sport film over time, right, and lots of sport films, the entire genre of sport films, is that the same situations, the same themes, the same icons come up over and over, right? So cumulative effect of films, they have repeated situations, themes, and icons. So we see a lot of repetition. We also see that sport films are often predictable. This probably doesn't surprise any of you, right? So a characteristic of the sport film genre is often that the outcomes are predictable. What I want you guys to think about this characteristic is, do you care that they're predictable? We can probably figure out that in a sport film there's going to be this climactic big game, right? There's a big game at the end and probably the hero is going to win. Does that decrease your enjoyment of it? Do you not like the movie because you probably already know the ending? Would you be willing to pay for it? Are you often willing to pay for movies that you pretty much already know the answer to? So if that's true, if you already know the answer and you're willing to pay for it, what do you get out of it? What does the audience get out of a movie that has a predictable ending? Think about that. As always, these are good questions to pose and answer for your participation boards. Okay? Back to our characteristics of the sport film genre is that they heavily rely on intertextual, I spelled that wrong, intertextual references. Intertextual references. Essentially, that just means that things that they've seen in other movies, right, other sport films would be the text there. They're indebted to the films of old, right? New sport films use a lot of the references from old sport films, okay? We also see that a characteristic of sport films is a strong connection to the culture. Sport films depend on symbolic use of key images, of key sounds that all are part of the culture from which they come. So if we're talking about Hollywood sport films, that would be American iconography, right? So the waving American flag, things like that. So symbols of America, symbols of the culture at the time are things that have strong connections in sport films, right? And finally, characteristics of a sport film is that sport films are functional for their society, right? They have a purpose. What do you think that purpose is? Going back to our theme from our last video and from chapter 1 in the introduction, what do you think the purpose is? What's the underlying purpose of sport films? And who gains from this purpose? How do they gain from this purpose? How are sport films functional for our society? So, to wrap up, today what we're trying to do is get a basic timeline of the emergence of sport films, right? Understand that emergence. We talked a little bit about boxing and how close the relationship is between the emergence of early film and prize fighting. And then we looked at sport film as a genre, defined genre itself, looked at the criteria for which we would use to figure out if a film is enough sport to be a sport film, and then what sport films in that genre have in common.